Mark my words, women don't belong in a fighter jet. Not now, not ever, General Harlow said, his voice flat, cold, and final. But when the base siren screamed and enemy aircraft closed in, the only pilot left was the quiet admin girl who'd been serving him coffee for 3 years. She didn't ask permission. She just walked toward the $150 million F-22 like it was hers. And moments later, 6 enemy fighters locked on her position. No backup, no second chances. The first missile hit before they even saw her coming. 1 down, then 2. Every maneuver defied the limits of the jet and the limits they'd put on her. In just 20 minutes, all 6 were nothing but smoke in the sky, and the base finally learned who she really was. Isabella Shade Lawson's mornings were as predictable as the Nevada sunrise. At precisely 6 o'clock hours, she would step through the glass doors of Nellis Air Force Base with a tray of steaming coffees balanced in one hand, folders tucked under the other. Her olive green contractor's uniform wasn't much different from what the civilian admin staff wore everywhere on base, but it might as well have been camouflage. She moved through the corridors, invisible to the very people she served. Her first stop was always the pilot's ready room. The space was loud with banter, the smell of jet fuel faint even indoors, and the kind of easy laughter that came from men who knew they were part of an elite fraternity. Isabella would make her rounds silently, placing coffee cups on tables without interrupting their conversations. Paperwork for the day's sorties went into neat stacks on the briefing table. If someone acknowledged her at all, it was with a distracted thanks without making eye contact. General Victor Harlow was the embodiment of the culture that kept Isabella in the background. At 55, with silver hair, crop regulation short, and a chest of ribbons from decades of service, Harlow commanded the 42nd Fighter Squadron with an unshakable confidence and an attitude about women in combat roles that belonged to another century. His voice carried across any room he entered, sharp and authoritative, and he was fond of delivering sweeping pronouncements as if they were irrefutable truths. In his mind, fighter jets were the pinnacle of a man's profession, a place for instinct, aggression, and split-second decisions that he believed women simply weren't built for. He didn't need to say it outright every day. His smirk when a female candidate's name came up, the way he avoided engaging with Isabella beyond perfunctory remarks, said enough. And if she ever doubted his stance, she could recall the exact morning he leaned across the briefing table, voice flat, cold, and final. Mark my words, women don't belong in a fighter jet. Not now, not ever. What Harlow and everyone else at Nellis didn't know was that Isabella Lawson had been flying long before most of the squadron's junior pilots had even touched a cockpit. She'd grown up in the shadow of her father, Colonel Marcus Viper Lawson, a name that still carried weight in the Air Force. Viper Lawson had been one of the most decorated F-22 Raptor pilots in history, a man whose call sign was spoken with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. His missions were the stuff of classified files and whispered speculation. But to Isabella, he was the man who taught her to ride a bike, then taught her to handle a control stick before she could even drive a car. Weekends of her childhood weren't spent at the mall or with friends. They were spent at small-town airfields where the smell of avgas hung in the air, and the metallic echo of hangar doors rolling open was as familiar as birdsong. Her father's lessons were methodical but unyielding. He drilled her on the fundamentals, pitch, yaw, roll, before moving to combat maneuvers and trainers, and eventually, under the cover of favors and old friendships, into the seat of military aircraft. By the time she was 23, she had clocked more hours in advanced fighters than some active-duty pilots. But skill wasn't the only currency in the Air Force. After Viper's final mission, one shrouded in secrecy over foreign skies, his name became entangled in politics. Whatever had happened out there was classified well above Isabella's clearance level, but the ripple effect was clear enough when she applied for Air Force pilot training after college. Her application was quietly buried. The official rejection letter cited eligibility complications, but the truth was simpler. No one wanted the potential liability of training Viper Lawson's daughter. And so Isabella adapted. She took the only position available that still put her near the aircraft she loved, administrative support for the squadron. From behind a desk, she kept the machine of the base running, scheduling sorties, processing maintenance requests, making sure briefing rooms were ready. And yes, delivering coffee. It was work that required precision and awareness, just not the kind that earned a flight suit. In the quiet moments between shuffling papers and answering phones, her gaze would drift to the tarmac outside, where the Raptors gleamed under the Nevada sun. She could trace every curve of their airframes from memory, knew the engine's pitch when idling versus at full afterburner. To the world, she was a background presence, a supporting role. Inside, she was a grounded pilot, biding her time. Real life, she knew, had a cruel way of overlooking talent. In civilian offices and military bases alike, people were sorted into boxes based on first impressions, last names, and the invisible weight of unspoken rules. Isabella had lived her whole adult life in one of those boxes, invisible to most, underestimated by the rest. But she also knew something that General Harlow didn't. Under the right circumstances, invisibility could be an advantage, because when no one sees you coming, they never see you take the controls either. November 15th began like any other day at Nellis Air Force Base. The kind of crisp desert morning where the sky looked endless and the air smelled faintly of jet fuel. Isabella Shade Lawson arrived on schedule, coffee tray in hand, stepping into the pilot's ready room as laughter bounced off the walls. A training exercise was set for 10 o'clock hours. Simulated air combat maneuvers against Mach enemy aircraft in a designated sector of Nevada airspace. The room buzzed with the familiar mix of confidence and competition. Pilots joked about who would rack up the most kills in the simulation. Lieutenant Cruz smirked over his cup, telling Captain Dawson, "Hope you brought your A-game. I don't plan on giving you a single lock-on today." General Harlow stood at the front, pointer in hand, going over the tactical map on the screen. Isabella moved quietly between them, distributing coffees, setting down folders, and listening more closely than anyone realized. Years of habit had taught her to absorb every detail, flight patterns, engagement rules, contingencies, all without looking like she was paying attention. By 9:30, the briefing was winding down when the sound hit. Not the steady buzz of routine intercom chatter, but the sharp, piercing wail of the base's emergency siren. Red strobes began flashing in the corners of the room. Every pilot froze for a fraction of a second before instinct kicked in. Chairs scraped back. Headsets were grabbed. Flight suits zipped. Harlow barked orders. "Let's move. This is not a drill." The intercom crackled with the base commander's voice, tight with urgency. "Attention all personnel. Multiple unidentified aircraft approaching from the southeast. Estimated time to base, 15 minutes. All pilots to aircraft immediately." Through the briefing room windows, Isabella saw the shift from order to controlled chaos. Ground crews sprinted across the tarmac. Fuel trucks barreled toward waiting jets. Security teams took up defensive positions along the perimeter. But within moments, the flawless rhythm broke, and the problem became obvious. Captain Dawson, halfway to the hangar, stopped dead, clutching his stomach. Lieutenant Cruz stumbled into the wall, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. One by one, more pilots faltered, doubling over in pain. Within minutes, nearly half of the squadron was down, victims of the same off-base restaurant from the night before. The food poisoning was merciless, striking fast, and with the clock ticking toward enemy contact, the squadron's strength was cut in half. Isabella stood near the doorway, coffee tray abandoned, watching the realization hit Harlow. The tactical display in the control room showed the incoming aircraft, red blips fanning out, approaching from multiple angles. Master Sergeant Dean Carter's voice broke through the tension. Sir, we've got 3 birds prepped, but to defend all vectors, we need at least 5 in the air. They'll punch through our lines in minutes if we don't spread the net. Harlow's jaw clenched. He stared at the screen, the red dots closing the gap. His voice rose, tight and frustrated. Where am I supposed to find 2 more pilots? It's not like we can pull someone off the street. Women can't fly fighter jets. This isn't a damn video game. The words landed like a slap in the dead silent room. Even amid the crisis, there was a beat of stillness. That unspoken moment when arrogance collides with reality. Isabella felt the heat rise in her chest, not from anger alone, but from the knowledge that this was it. The moment she had been waiting for, though she hadn't planned it this way. She stepped forward, boots firm against the tile, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "General Harlow," she said evenly, "I can fly." Heads turned. A couple of the healthier pilots gave short, incredulous laughs. Even Carter's brows shot up. Harlow turned toward her slowly, as if he had just heard someone claim the earth was flat. "Excuse me." "I can fly, sir," Isabella repeated, her tone unshaken. "F-22 Raptor. I'm qualified." A ripple of disbelief passed through the room. Harlow's voice dripped with condescension. "This isn't some simulator in your garage, Lawson. These are $150 million aircraft." And she cut him off without raising her voice. "Colonel Marcus Lawson was my father. Call sign Viper. He trained me in F-16s and F-22s from the time I was 16 until he died. I have over 800 hours in military aircraft. And right now, you don't have enough pilots to defend this base." The room went still. Carter's eyes widened. "Viper Lawson's kid. Sir, she's not bluffing." Harlow glanced at the tactical display again. The red blips now less than 10 minutes out. His pride warred with the hard math in front of him. Every second he hesitated was a second the enemy closed in. Isabella stepped closer, locking eyes with him. "You can let your ego cost American lives, or you can let me do the job I've been trained to do." There was a long pause, the siren still wailing in the background. Then Carter moved. "Aircraft 074143 is fueled and armed," he said, looking straight at Isabella. "Your call sign is Shade. Get in the air." Harlow didn't stop him. He didn't have to agree out loud. The decision had been made. Isabella grabbed a flight suit from the gear rack, sliding into it with practiced efficiency. Every motion was muscle memory. Zip, fasten gloves, helmet. She stepped past Harlow without another word, the siren lights strobing across her visor. Out on the tarmac, the Raptors gleamed under the desert sun. Somewhere in the distance, 6 hostile aircraft were closing in, and Nellis Air Force Base was about to see what the invisible pilot could do. The ready room still smelled faintly of burnt coffee and jet fuel when Isabella stepped forward. The sirens outside hadn't stopped. Each rising wail a reminder that time was running out. The floor seemed to vibrate beneath her boots, from the warning system, from the pounding in her chest, or maybe both. "General Harlow," she said, voice level, but carrying enough to cut through the chaos. "I can fly." At first, there was no reaction, just the dull hum of electronics and the distant thrum of activity on the flight line. Then a few heads turned. One of the junior pilots let out a short, incredulous laugh, as if he'd misheard her, and found his own misunderstanding amusing. Another smirked into his coffee cup. Harlow finally turned from the tactical screen. The look he gave her was a mix of irritation and disbelief. The kind you might give a child claiming they could lift a car. "What did you just say?" "I said," Isabella repeated, slow and deliberate, "I can fly. F-22 Raptor. I'm qualified." That's when the laughter broke out. Low chuckles from the back of the room. Someone muttering, "Right? And I'm the president." Even in a moment of genuine danger, thought of the quiet admin girl in the cockpit of a $150 million fighter jet was so absurd to them that it had to be a joke. Harlow's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. Lawson, this isn't a joyride in Cessna. These aircraft, my father, she said, not raising her voice, but slicing clean through his, was Colonel Marcus Lawson, call sign Viper. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, 47 confirmed air-to-air kills. He trained me personally in F-16s and in F-22s. The room went still. The smirks froze. Carter, standing near the door, straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as if making a connection. I have, Isabella continued, 847 hours of actual flight time in military aircraft, not simulators, not fantasy. Real cockpits, real airspace, real maneuvers. She looked around at them one by one, letting the words land. And right now, you're 3 pilots short. Someone near the back whispered, Viper's kid. The name carried weight, even here, even years after her father's final classified mission. Marcus Viper Lawson was a legend. Those who had flown with him told stories that didn't need embellishing. If she was telling the truth, and the calm steel in her voice suggested she was, then this was no ordinary coffee runner standing in front of them. Harlow's jaw tightened. You're a civilian contractor. You deliver coffee and file papers. You're not cleared to. When the moment comes, sweetheart, don't ask for permission. Prove it. The memory cut through her like sunlight in a storm. Her father's voice, low and steady in her ears on a long-ago afternoon in a dusty hangar. She'd been 16, hands trembling on the stick of a T-38 trainer after nearly botching a landing. He put a hand on her shoulder and told her those exact words. She took a breath, letting the echo of that lesson steady her now. Sir, you can court-martial me later if you want, but in less than 10 minutes, those aircraft will be in our airspace. You have a choice. Let me fly, or let your base take a hit you'll never recover from. A tense silence hung in the room. Carter was the first to break it. Sir, if she's telling the truth about her hours, she can handle a Raptor. And right now, we don't have the luxury of debates. Another voice chimed in. Lieutenant Hale, one of the 3 healthy pilots. We need every bird in the air. If she's good enough, I'd rather have her covering my flank than an empty slot. Harlow's eyes flicked from the red blips on the screen to Isabella, to Carter, then back to the screen. The math was simple, even if his pride complicated it. The enemy was closing fast. Hesitation was a luxury he didn't have. Aircraft 074143, Carter said, already moving toward the gear lockers. She's fueled, armed and ready. Call sign will be Shade. Harlow still hadn't given a direct order, but he didn't stop Carter either. And in a place like this, sometimes silence was as good as approval. Isabella strode to the lockers. The flight suit was cool against her skin, the heavy fabric settling over her shoulders like a second identity she'd been forced to keep in storage for years. She zipped it up, gloves on, helmet under her arm. Every motion was automatic, the product of hours her father had drilled into her without compromise. As she passed Harlow on her way to the door, she met his gaze. For a fraction of a second, neither spoke. Then she said, You'll see. The corridor to the flight line was alive with movement. Crew chiefs shouting to each other over the roar of engines. The smell of jet exhaust thick in the air. Somewhere beyond the hangars, the Nevada sky waited, bright and endless. And in the distance, 6 hostile aircraft were bearing down. Carter caught up with her at the hangar door, handing over a data slate. Mission parameters uploaded. Radar will feed directly to your HUD. Towers on standby. Understood, she said, and stepped into the sunlight. On the tarmac, the F-22 waited, sleek, lethal, and utterly familiar. She could feel her pulse slow, her breathing settle. This was where she belonged. Not behind a desk, not invisible in the background. Here, in the seat of a Raptor, She could speak the only language that ever mattered in her father's world, performance. And she intended to make herself heard loud enough for General Harlow and everyone else to remember. The flight suit clung to Isabella's shade Lawson like a second skin. The heavy Nomex fabric settling over her shoulders with a weight that felt more like belonging than burden. The glove slid on smooth, the leather flexing just enough to allow precision. The helmet, when she locked it under her arm, carried with it the faint scent of polymer and sweat, the unmistakable smell of real flight, not a simulator. Every piece of gear had a place, every strap and latch, a sequence and muscle memory drilled into her since she was old enough to understand the stakes of the sky. She moved across the tarmac toward the F-22 Raptor, waiting under the Nevada sun. Its surfaces caught the light like liquid steel, edges sharp as a blade, yet the entire frame seemed to hum with restrained violence. To anyone else, it was a war machine. To her, it was home. Carter walked alongside her, voice pitched over the roar of jet engines. 074143 is yours. Weapons hot. Towers on Channel 1. She nodded once. No wasted words. Climbing the ladder into the cockpit felt like stepping through a threshold she'd been barred from for years. Her boots found the rungs without thought. Her hands gripped metal that felt warm under the sun. Settling into the seat, she felt the contour cradle her the way only a familiar machine could. Fingers moved instinctively. Master power on. Avionics online. Engine start sequence. The twin Pratt and Whitney F-119 engines spooled up with a rising whine, deepening into a growl that vibrated through her chest. HUD flickered to life. Green symbology painting data across her visor. Shade Tower. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Throttle forward. The Raptor surged down the runway, the acceleration pinning her to the seat. At 180 knots, she eased back on the stick. The nose lifted, gear retracted, and the ground dropped away. The desert spread beneath her, a canvas of gold and ochre while the sky opened ahead, a cathedral of blue hers to command. It was cinematic in every sense. The sun low enough to cast long shadows, the gleam of the Raptor's skin, contrails painting arcs overhead. But the beauty was just a backdrop to the work. At 35,000 feet, her radar lit up. 6 unknown contacts closing fast. Adjusting gain and filters, she cycled through profiles. These weren't friendly aircraft. No IFF pings, no comms, tight combat formations. Her voice was steady when she transmitted. Tower shade. 6 unknowns bearing 135. Recommend classify as hostile. Harlow's voice came through, clipped. Confirmed. Weapons free. Phase 1, the first kill. She climbed to 45,000 feet, using the Raptor's stealth profile to vanish from enemy sensors. The tactic was textbook Viper Lawson. Come from above and behind, using the sun to blind. Dropping in from high altitude, she locked onto the trailing bogey, thumbed the trigger. Fox 3. The AIM-120 AMRAAM streaked ahead, invisible until the final moment. The enemy never saw it. Splash 1. By attacking from the rear quadrant with radar minimized, she gave the target almost zero reaction time, a principle her father called making them fight shadows. Phase 2, speed and shock. The remaining 5 scattered, but she was already moving. Pushing the throttle into afterburner, she cut across their escape arcs, locking the second target before he could regroup. Another Fox 3. Another bloom of fire in the sky. Without breaking momentum, she rolled inverted, sighted the third target, and switched to guns for the close pass. The Vulcan cannon's burst was precise, stitching fire across the fuselage. Splash 3. Engaging a second target before the first debris cleared the air, kept the group off balance. Speed denies the enemy time to think. Phase 3, the impossible turn. 2 bogies swung around to get on her 6, a classic pincer. Isabella's voice in her head was her father's again. Make the move. They don't think you can survive. She pulled a high G Cobra maneuver, nose up to near vertical, bleeding speed in seconds, forcing both pursuers to overshoot. In that instant, she dropped back onto their tails. One missile for the first, a gun burst for the second. Splash 4. Splash 5. High alpha maneuvers are risky, but in the Raptor's supermaneuverable frame, they can turn defense into offense instantly. Phase 4, the final strike. The last enemy was making a run for the base, perhaps hoping to get through while she was busy. She dropped to low altitude, hugging the terrain to stay off his radar, then climbed up behind him in a steep intercept. Two-tone lock confirmed. She smiled just slightly. Fox 3. The missile found its mark. Splash 6. Low altitude approach masked radar signature until the final climb, giving the target no time to react. When the last red blip vanished from her scope, the silence in her headset felt almost louder than the battle. Shade Tower. All targets neutralized. Base is secure. She eased the throttle back, backing toward home. Below, the desert stretched quiet and endless again. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse steadied. In the debrief later, they would talk about tactics and maneuvers. Pilots would study the gun camera footage, pausing to marvel at the timing, the precision. But for Isabella, it was simpler. This was the language she had been taught all her life. Not speeches, not arguments, performance. And in less than 20 minutes, she had spoken it fluently enough that no one at Nellis Air Force Base would ever forget her name. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing inside the helmet and the low, steady hum of the engines. The sky ahead was empty. No contrails, no radar pings, no threats, just silence. Then the radio crackled, the voice of Master Sergeant Dean Carter breaking through with an audible grin. Shade Tower, all bogies destroyed. Outstanding work. Base is secure. Other voices followed, overlapping in the comms. Pilots still airborne, controllers in the tower. Even a few ground crew on open channels. Short, stunned phrases. Unbelievable. That was insane. 6 kills, 1 sortie. Isabella Shade Lawson didn't respond with fanfare. She simply keyed her mic, copy tower. Shade inbound for landing. She brought the F-22 around in a wide arc, lining up with the runway. The descent was smooth, controlled. No need to showboat now. Gear down, flaps set. The Raptor kissed the tarmac and rolled out with the practiced ease of someone who knew every nuance of its handling. As the canopy lifted, warm desert air rushed in, carrying the faint tang of jet exhaust and dust. Out beyond the yellow safety lines, they were waiting for her. Mechanics with oil-stained uniforms, ground crew in reflective vests, pilots in half-flight suits, even clerks from the admin building, all lined up along the edge of the tarmac. Some were clapping, others just staring as if they still didn't quite believe what they'd heard over the radio. She powered down the engines, the turbine whine fading into silence, and unstrapped from the seat. When she stepped down the ladder, boots hitting the concrete, the crowd parted slightly, and through it came General Victor Harlow. He didn't rush. His cap was tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable. The man who less than an hour ago had flatly declared that women didn't belong in a fighter jet now stopped a few feet from her and looked her in the eye. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Harlow did something few present would ever forget. He brought his hand up in a crisp salute. It wasn't hesitant, and it wasn't begrudging. It was the same salute he would give any combat pilot who had just defended the base. She returned it without hesitation, the brims of their gloves catching the sunlight. When their hands lowered, Isabella tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but pointed. "Will you judge me by my performance?" she asked. "Or by the assumptions you made when I was serving coffee?" It wasn't a challenge shouted in anger, but a question meant to cut deeper, because it wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever dismissed her before they'd seen her in her element. Harlow's eyes flickered, maybe with the weight of the question, maybe with the awareness that the crowd was listening. He didn't answer directly, but he nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, and stepped aside. Carter clapped her on the shoulder as she walked past. "Shade," he said with a grin. "I think you just rewrote the squadron handbook." By the next morning, nothing about her official job had changed. She still arrived at 6 o'clock hours with a tray of coffee, still filed the day's paperwork, still set up the briefing rooms. But the way people looked at her had shifted. Conversations paused when she passed, and when her name came up, it carried a new weight. On the wall outside the ready room, someone had taped up a grainy still from the gun camera footage, a missile impact blooming into fire against the high sky. Below it, written in marker, "Shade 6 for 6. And as she moved through the base, quiet as ever, Isabella knew the truth. Her position on the roster might not have changed, but her place in their minds never would again. When the dust settles after a moment like this, it's not just the scoreboard that matters. It's the lesson left behind. Isabella Shade Lawson's flight wasn't only about skill in the cockpit. It was about what happens when you refuse to let someone else's definition of you become your reality. In today's America, that lesson rings far beyond the walls of an Air Force base. How many times in our modern lives do people get placed in a box, judged by their job title, their age, their gender, or the role they've been seen in for years? Maybe it's the older worker overlooked for promotion because they're too set in their ways. Maybe it's the young person dismissed as inexperienced before they've had a chance to prove themselves, or the quiet neighbor you've known for years who's got a lifetime of skill and wisdom you've never seen. In Shade's story, the battle wasn't just against 6 enemy aircraft. It was against years of silent prejudice. And when the sirens wailed, she didn't waste time convincing people with words. She showed them in action who she really was. That's a challenge we can all take into our own lives. When the moment comes, let your work, your decisions, and your results speak louder than any assumption. I'd like to hear from you. Has there ever been a time in your life when you were underestimated and you proved people wrong? Or maybe you've seen someone else step out of the shadows and change everything in a single moment. Share it in the comments because these stories matter. They remind us that potential is everywhere, even where we least expect it. And here's a thought to stir the conversation. What would have happened if Harlow had doubled down and refused to the cockpit? Would the base have been lost? Or would someone else have stepped up in an unexpected way? That's the thing about moments like these. They hinge on a single decision, and they can define a lifetime. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the quiet strengths in your own life, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We've got more stories coming. Stories about courage, resilience, and the unexpected heroes walking among us. Because sometimes, the person you've been overlooking is the very one who can save the day.